Buenos días, tardes y noches a todos. Esta transmisión será en inglés. Abajo está el enlace para los que quieran verlo en español, ya que estoy continuando lo que debía haber subido la semana pasada sobre Génesis en inglés. Ya lo hemos visto en español. Good evening, afternoon, or everybody, or evening to everybody who's watching this. Today's special will be in English, since I did not do a thorough job with last week's study of Genesis, since I had to take off a few days because I was beginning to feel under the weather. Okay. La semana pasada no subí videos porque hubo algunos ratos que yo me sentía con síntomas de gripa y eso me impedía a hacer un trabajo como mi Dios se lo merece para estudiar esto. Quiero dar saludos a la librería guadalupana Nuevo Amanecer en el Anaheim Marketplace. I was feeling under the weather, a little bit with some flu-like symptoms some days last week, which is the main reason why as I was saying, shout out to Librería Guadalupana Nueva Amanecer en el Anaheim Marketplace. Hoy vamos a continuar con un estudio de Biblia. Today we're going to study with Genesis 11. Those wanting to reach it in Spanish, we have the link down below. Now it says here, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Shinar is now what is the northern half of Iraq. The northern half of Mesopotamia is what was known as the region of Shinar. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may not make a name, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we would be scattered over the face of the whole world. Notice, when they stepped out of the ark, God ordered them to go throughout the world, to populate the world. Right here, they're making three major mistakes. Number one, they're disobeying God by not populating the world. They want to all stay put. And number two, this is a challenge to God. It is arrogance. That's why they want to build this tower that goes up to heaven. Okay, now it is commonly believed that these towers are the ziggurats, which were supposed to be some ginormous pyramid-like structures. But since this tower was never finished being built, we have no way of knowing how tall it really was. Around that region, there are a lot of ziggurats. Let's find an image of a ziggurat so you know what I'm talking about. I know some of you, when you think of a ziggurat, you're thinking of a maybe an app used for tables or something like that. But no, the ziggurat was actually a building that looked much like these. These were the ziggurats. Notice that some of these ziggurats actually looked like the pyramids of Latin America. These ziggurats were supposed to have being a mix between towers and pyramids, and they were built as places of worship. Hence the word ziggurat, hence the word Babel. You see this here, for example, as ziggurat to Marduk. For example, the great ziggurat of Ur, in what is now Kuwait, and so on. Now, these ziggurats were temples, were ancient temples, but they're building this ziggurat or ancient temple to themselves as a people. Hence, it is pretty much self-worship or the arrogance of themselves. The word, this famous tower later on becomes known as a Tower of Babel. There's an interesting play of words here because Babel comes from the Hebrew metbalbel, which means to get confused. But it also comes from the ancient Semitic phrase Bab El, meaning the door to God. So they were trying to reach up and be equal to gods. We could probably say the sin of Eden, part 2. In part 1, the sin was wanting to be like gods in knowledge. Now they want to be like gods in majesty, so they're trying to build this great tower. Sadly, we all have nowadays our own Tower of Babels. Many people, for example, build monuments to themselves in the form of what we now call reputations. People try, what do we say? Build a name for yourself. They talk about these wonderful things, wonderful heights. Or other people build their own Tower of Babel through their wealth, trying to acquire all this wealth that they don't even use when there are other people who are starving. No, I'm not promoting communism or any of that. But if you fail in your religious obligations and in your social obligations out of greed, that greed becomes your Tower of Babel. Other people try to make a name for themselves militarily. Great nations. Oh, this is a great, the great military of the world. Businesses. How many brand names are there? We have these great businesses that have built themselves an empire. And then once they reach their height, what do? They turn their backs against God. We see the Olympics, a great Tower of Babel towards Olympics. And what did they do this summer? All these people building a name for themselves. The Olympic Committee and the city of Paris making a name for themselves. Then they turned their backs on God, and then you had this ceremony mocking God. Though the existence of the actual Tower of Babel is true for many, and some of them don't consider it maybe direct history, we do see it manifested itself through the arrogance that we have. Another Tower of Babel that has risen up is wokeness, woke culture, the LGBT rights, and all this nonsense. They're trying to reach the heavens, not because they want to reach God, but because they want to replace God with their own sadistic fantasies. Verse 5, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. Notice the word here, confuse. That's where we get the word Babel from. That's where the tower gets its name, and then the city and the empire get their name from that tower. So the Lord scattered them from all over, from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language. Babel is Hebrew for confusion. He confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Some people plant this as some fantasy, but even in linguistics, there's this thing called Nostratic theory, which does lay some of the foundation to honestly believe this. We know, for example, all of the European languages and many Asian languages, or South Asian languages, I should be more specific, do come from the same origin called the Indo-European languages. Persian, Sanskrit, German, Spanish, Greek, all of these came from that same branch of languages. But then there's another belief that connects even what's called the Hamito-Semitic of Northern Africa and the Middle East to the same branch, possibly. We've discussed how many of these branches break off from each other last week when we spoke about Genesis chapter 10. Verse 10, from Shem to Abram. Notice at first it doesn't have the H. There's a reason for it. When it comes to the H, it then becomes a change in name because of a change of purpose. This is the account of Shem's family line. Remember, Shem was one of the children of Noah when they came out of the ark. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. Now, Arphaxad, as I mentioned at another time, refers to a specific region. Let's travel to the Middle East so that we could see what are we talking about. All right. Come with me. Let's take an airplane and land in the Middle East so that we see what we are referring to. Now, this great area up here was what was known as the plains of Shinar, also Akkad. But now it is telling us here that one of the children of Shem, wandered off and established Arphaxad. Arphaxad was this region here, going through central Syria, starting in Damascus, and part of Iraq. This area was known as Arphaxad. And it tells us that he was about 100 years old. Remember, these ages are not meant to be taken literally. They are more like to represent spiritual reality. In other words, the purity, the spiritual purity, you could say. After he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters. Okay. Let's get back so you can see the reading as I read along. So jump to the calendar, to the map as we see fit. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. Now, Shelah here, Shelah comes from the Hebrew word shalah, which means to send off. Could this be because during the time of Arphaxad, the people were sent off away from the plains of Shinar and started migrating everybody in their own directions? He became the father of Arphaxad in 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. Eber in Hebrew means to cross over. Okay, so we see two references for crossing over here. We see one reference to actually crossing over the rivers, but we also see another reference to crossing over in terms of identity. You see, God had created all these peoples, but some of these peoples migrated and left. Some of these peoples decided to follow God instead. So they crossed over instead of following their own pagan ways of doing things. It says here, when Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. Peleg in Hebrew means division. It means to divide. In chapter 10, which we saw last week, it tells us that the reason why Peleg received that name was because during that time, the world began to be divided out. In other words, nations started establishing borders. So we see that Shem connects us to which son of Noah. Then the other ones, the Shelah, Eber, and Peleg, connect us to events that were taking place. Shelah being sent forth, in other words, the migration away from Shinar. Eber, the transitioning um, from being like the other peoples to being a people more chosen by God. Peleg, the division of the borders. Eber lived 430 years and had sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he became the father of Reu. Reu in Hebrew means to shepherd. I leave that for you to reminisce on. And after he became the father of Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and had other sons and daughters. Could it be that Reu reflects God watching over this very same people of Eber, having selected them, hence the crossing over and the separation? You see, it starts talking in here about how all of humanity was created. But once all of humanity was created, now they are being separate. The people chosen by God are being separated by God. And we see that reflected in the names Peleg, in names like Peleg, names like Eber. We see the name of Reu, which means to shepherd, and God shepherding those who are to become his people. When Reu had lived 32 years, he became father of Serug, and after that, he became father. After he became father of Serug, Reu lived 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor. And after he became the father of Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and had other sons and daughters. Now we are coming to see actual peoples. We're starting with verse 24. But before we move on, I want to call your attention here to one important thing. Let's see. Actually, don't. Let's tell you a bit more than I want to call your attention to something very specific. Verse 24. When Nahor lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah. And after he became the father of Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and had other sons and daughters. And Terah had lived 70 years and had become the father of Abram, Nahor, and Aran. Now, on verse 26, we finally see Abram, the actual father, the actual Abraham, which we're going to find out about earlier. I mean, in a few minutes. I want to point out a very important thing here. Let's look at how many generations were there after the flood before the coming of Abraham. After the flood, we have Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, and finally Terah. We see 9 generations between the flood, and then we finally have Abraham. 9 generations. I want you guys to compare this with Nimrod, which we saw on chapter 10. The sons of Ham, Cush, and then we see the sons of Cush, Sheba, Havilah, Sapta, Ramah, Sapteka, sons of Ramah. But we see here it says Cush was the father of Nimrod. 3 generations. Why is this important to point out? It is important to point it out because there is a false teaching out there which is so much promoted in a book of lies called the Two Babylons, which in and of itself is another Tower of Babel that by Protestant, by this guy called Hislop, who, to excuse and promote his hatred against Catholicism, he invented these lies about supposedly Semiramis being mixed up with this guy called Nimrod. But we just saw that it's impossible because Semiramis lived around the time of King Ahab. Nimrod lived only 3 generations after. There are 9 generations between Abraham and Nimrod. And even after that, there are still many more generations between Abraham and Ahab. Therefore, it is impossible for there ever to have been any kind of union between Nimrod and Semiramis. That such union does not exist except in the nasty imagination, the dirty mind of those who choose to follow the false gospel of Hislop instead of the actual Bible. Let's continue seeing what this says. We were left further on down here. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. We see Terah had 3 sons, Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran became the father of Lot. This is very important for you to keep in mind for when we get to chapter 13. You do not fall into the certain lies that many Protestants make in the interpretation of biblical Hebrew. You see, we see here that Abraham, Nahor, and Haran were brothers. If Haran was the brother of Abraham, and then Haran has a son called Lot, by definition, we will find that Lot and Abraham are uncle and nephew. Lot happens to be the nephew of Abraham. But we do not see it phrased like that in the Bible because the biblical Hebrew has no word for nephew. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Let's find where Ur was located so that we see the route of migration that Abraham had. He was currently in Ur of the Chaldees, which was right over here next to the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates River. When God calls them out, as we are to see is to happen, he starts migrating northwest along the rivers of Babylon, and then south along the Mediterranean. We call that stretch of land the Fertile Crescent. So Abraham lived in Ur along with his family. But God calls Abraham to move out. So right now, Genesis 11 is just giving us an introduction to who Abraham and his family were. Later on, he's going to take us through the major events in Abraham's life. Continues telling us, Abraham and Nahor both got married, obviously not to each other. They were two brothers. They had their own wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. I find it very interesting here. Abraham's wife's name is Sarai, which means princess, while Nahor's wife is Milcah, which means queen. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. So Haran was also the father of Milcah and Iscah. Let's see. Haran was Lot. Haran was the father of Lot and of Milcah and Iscah. So in essence, Lot, his nephew, happens to be at the same time his brother-in-law. And yes, for those who are questioning, yes, Haran did marry his own cousin, as we see here. But as we're going to see through the life of the patriarchs, in the time of the patriarchs, it was expected that they marry within the family so as to not fall into the worship of pagan gods like those cultures who were around them. Now, Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. That we're going to see that becomes a major issue as Abraham gets older. We'll see that in coming verses. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran. Notice Haran here, and then there's another Haran up here. One with two R's, one with one R. One's a person, the other one is the land. Let's go look at where this land was. Some people actually think that it still is around and pretty much unchanged from the time of Abraham. Here we see where Haran actually is. We see that Haran today is in the border between Syria and Turkey. Notice Ur was down here, and now he migrates. Abraham migrates with his father, his wife, his nephew slash brother-in-law, and so on, and they migrate northwest along the Tigris and Euphrates River, and they establish themselves in Haran. And that's where chapter 11 has us see the end of it. We see then that chapter 11 of Genesis ends right here. As always, remember, long live the Lord Jesus Christ!